This series of 1-minute explainers looks at 5 personality traits and 4 metatraits. And these traits are known as the 5-factor model, which I've placed at the core of my larger model for understanding who we are and how we learn. Each trait is explored as individual scales or spectrums, but more importantly, they're not meant to have expectations placed on them as being better or worse, right or wrong, and that there's no best combination of these traits. Whatever we might think is desirable might just be a product of our own balance of traits affected by whatever societal or social media has presented as desirable, and most importantly, if we recognize and reflect on the strengths of different combinations of these traits, we might have a better sense of how to connect with different trait combinations in our colleagues, our students, and even our friends and family. Now, extraversion is a trait that's all about exerting and recycling social energy. The higher a person is on this extraversion scale, the more likely they are to exert and recycle this social energy, which means they're more likely to engage in exciting situations or social conversations. A person lower on this extraversion scale is often referred to as more introverted and tends to reserve their social energy and need more time to recover when that energy is exerted. So it's important to highlight that difference because it isn't that this person can't be exciting or sociable, and even more important is just how many people fall somewhere in the middle of this scale. So again, it's not that it's better to be higher or lower, it's about recognizing what it means to be more or less extroverted and how that interacts with the other traits in this layer. Openness is a fascinating and challenging trait, especially for educators, because we want students to focus on the objectives in our planned lessons. So the students who are lower on this openness scale might be more passive when we introduce new or novel concepts or experiences, but will focus more on what is and what needs to be done. And that's important when you're trying to teach specific things. But for those who are higher on this openness scale, even though they may be more open to novel concepts and experiences, they can find themselves frustrated to learn only what is taught that might not always be what they want to learn. Those who are higher on this scale and who are also more extroverted might find interest in artistic endeavors, while those less extroverted may find topics like computer and natural sciences as creative outlets for this trait. Now, neuroticism can be a difficult trait largely because of our lack of knowledge of it as a valuable trait like any other. I like to think of this trait as our capacity to sense danger. This means being too low on this trait scale is actually just as concerning as being too high on this scale. While we might hear about people on social media having no fear, no anxiety, no negative thoughts or feelings of guilt, anger, or envy, but those are actually healthy human feelings and emotions that serve meaningful purposes, so long as they aren't overwhelming to the point of major depression or being overly self-conscious and anxious with everyday interactions and activities. So like the other traits, most people fall somewhere in the middle of this scale. And it's more about recognizing our tendency to experience more or less of this trait in different situations. And we do this so we can learn to manage these feelings and emotions in healthy ways. Now, agreeableness looks at how we internalize and express pro-social behaviors like trusting, empathizing, and it isn't that a person lower on this scale can't or doesn't exhibit pro-social behaviors, they just may do so differently or conditionally. We might hear words describe a person as distant, unfriendly, uncooperative, but it's important to recognize how it's at this end of the agreeableness scale where we find our best scientists, our surgeons, our social rights activists, and other roles that require a person not to be afraid to ask tough questions, even when it makes others uncomfortable. So like other traits, most people fall somewhere in the middle of this scale, some a bit higher, some lower, and it's in recognizing what this trait looks, sounds, and feels like that we recognize how to value what this trait offers as it relates to a person's other traits. Conscientiousness is a fairly straightforward trait that looks at how we organize our thoughts and actions. The person higher on this scale will tend to be more organized and orderly in how they plan and meet specific goals with clear criteria for success. Now, the higher on this scale, the more precision and accuracy will be desired. Contrast that with a person lower on this scale, who is less likely to think through how exactly they'll reach a particular goal. It isn't that a person lower on the scale is any less capable, it's that they may just be less organized in their thoughts and actions toward meeting that specific goal. And for educators, we might expect our students to share in what we think are best practices for organizing not just thoughts and actions, but also belongings and resources in ways that align with being higher on this scale, because that's where we might be or desire to be on this scale. Now, there are two primary metatraits, stability and plasticity, and these are awesome because they connect combinations of these 5 traits to chemicals in our body. What that means, for example, is a person low on the Neuroticism scale and high on the Conscientiousness and Agreeableness scales are probably pretty consistent when it comes to emotional, motivational, and social stability. And so we have this metatrait, stability, and what's awesome is the idea that serotonin, which acts as our body's mood stabilizer, relates to this stability metatrait. Now, on the other side, you have the plasticity metatrait. That's awesome because it relates dopamine to the extraversion and openness traits and looks at a person's tendency to seek out, explore, and voluntarily engage in creative concepts and novel experiences, which I'll be connecting to the next layer of my larger model for who we are and how we learn. The other two metatraits are self-restraint and integration. Self-restraint is essentially high stability and low plasticity. So we'd see a stronger influence from changes in serotonin and less influence of changes in dopamine, which means we'd see a much more controlled perspective towards behavior and a stronger sense of conformism and conventionality. But of course, the opposite can be true with high plasticity and low stability. So we'd see a stronger influence from changes in dopamine and less influence in changes in serotonin, in which case we'd see more sensation-seeking and impulsiveness, instigation, higher emotional reactivity. But most people aren't on one side or the other, especially when it comes to these extreme personality profiles. And so we want to look at the last metatrait, integration, which I personally like to think about as an open interpretation for what might be an optimal balance or integration of all 5 traits. There's a reason I've placed this personality trait theory at the core of my model for who we are and how we learn. There is a very low chance that any one educator has 2 students who have the exact same balance of personality traits and whose metatraits reflect the exact same biochemical release, uptake, and recycling of serotonin and dopamine in their developing systems. And so when we as educators apply one classroom management approach requiring nearly all students to abide by a single set of behavioral expectations every year, every day, every hour, that it's largely because of our own personality combination that benefits from the learning environment we're responsible for creating. And it's arguably necessary that teachers impose such strict expectations, if only for the health and safety of having so many students coming and going in and out of their classrooms each day. But think about how one teacher's classroom can look and feel so differently than other classrooms on the same campus. As educators, our own balance of personality traits and metatraits come through in how we design and manage our classrooms. And when students struggle to learn in our classrooms, it can be frustrating because we've designed it to be an effective learning environment for all of our students. So to us, it's more likely the student isn't doing what we're telling them will result in them learning what we're teaching them. And what this core layer of my model hopefully helps us understand is that you can design your classroom to have control over the health and safety of your students. But when it comes to learning, it's in our best interest to reflect on personalities that might be in direct conflict with the personality we've imbued into the design and management of our classrooms.